Thank you so much for attending the Stormwater Victoria webinar on the latest Melbourne Water Music Modelling Guidelines. Next slide, please, Liv. Before we get too far, I want to stop and acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'm calling into this webinar from their traditional lands. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and I extend my respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us at the webinar today. I would like to encourage you to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which you're joining this webinar. You can just type it into the chat function, and it's a really nice way to bring us together a bit. Next slide, please, Liv. We're going to hear from some presenters from Melbourne Water and E2 Design Lab. The presentation is going to run about 40 minutes, and there's a question and answer session following the presentation. Next slide, please, Liv. How do you ask your questions, you might ask? You ask them by typing them into the chat. Please include your name and affiliation just to make it feel a bit more collegial. I'll go ahead and ask those questions to the presenters following the presentation. If you see a great question in the chat and you want to make sure it gets answered, please give that question a big thumbs up. And just remember that the chat is a public forum, so please maintain professional language. Thank you so much. I'm going to hand it over. That's all for me. Thank you.
All righty, thank you, Julia. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Liv Blair-Holt. I'm an environmental engineer with an IWM background and the Stormwater Advisor in the Flood Strategy and Stormwater Policy team at Melbourne Water. Our team's been the one leading the update for this. I'm joined by Dr. Dale Brown from E2 Design Lab. Dale's an expert in the modelling and design of WSID systems with an extensive experience across both development and application of practical applied models for stormwater and waterway management. And we'll be joined at the Q&A at the end by a couple of members from the Melbourne Water team. So as a virtual session, I know we'll spread across a lot of different areas, and our operating area as Melbourne Water is also across a lot of country. So Melbourne Water respectfully acknowledges the Bunurong, Gunai-Kurnai, Taungurung, Wadawurrung and Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples as the traditional owners and custodians of the land and water on which we rely and operate. We recognise and respect the continued cultural and spiritual connections that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have with the land and water they have cared for and protected for thousands of generations. Today, I'm on the lands of the Wadawurrung people in Geelong. And I'm sure many of you are joining for other lands. I'd like to personally pay my respects to the Wadawurrung elders, past and present, and to any people from other communities who might be here with us today. So at Melbourne Water, we have a hand in managing all parts of the water cycle, from drinking water, collecting and treating wastewater, managing our flood and drainage systems, keeping our waterways and catchments healthy. Today, obviously, we're focused on stormwater at that interface between our drainage and our waterways. Today, we're going to discuss the updated music modelling guideline. I'll talk through a bit of the background, introduce what's changing. Dale will get into some of the detail on the changes and their implications. We'll give an overview of what's coming next and then have some time for questions at the end. Now, there might be some questions that we can't answer today, so we'll take them offline and make sure we get the right answer and make sure it's shared with you. Background. So the purpose of this document is to provide guidance on modelling approaches and input parameters for music models that are submitted to us at Melbourne Water. We receive a large number of these models every year, and this guideline helps us and practitioners to model and achieve the stormwater treatment objectives by supporting consistent, fair and evidence-based approaches to stormwater treatment concept design, by ensuring that that modelling is specific to our region's climate and geology, and by making that model development and assessment smoother for everyone. So the 2023 release updates the guideline with some information gaps and incorporates recent advancements in both science and industry. The update was developed with peer review, scientific research and stakeholder engagement across Melbourne's stormwater industry. That process, so that this guideline has been updated a number of times, and the last one was in 2018. In 2020 and 2021, we started the background work for this, looking at the feedback over the years, questions we keep getting, what's changed in the industry and what science is telling us. And we've decided to do this in two updates. So this one's release A, which is focused on that refinement and clarification, making the modelling that we're doing currently better reflect what we know. The next one that we'll work on is called Release B, and that'll include more changes supporting the shift to flow targets. And many of you will have attended some sessions on that with us in the past. That'll be looking at how we understand the infiltration, evaporation, and harvesting in these models. So we had a draft document, new climate templates that was reviewed internally, and that climate data was peer reviewed. A couple of updates. So the peer review team were happy. Then some broader review, subject matter experts at Melbourne Water, the urban planning development team, the industry consultation, and that included feedback from local government, consultants, suppliers, and the urban development advisory forum that we had at the time. So that feedback was received. We had some follow-up interviews for further discussion, some final Melbourne Water reviews, and now onto the launch. So there are some new things from the 2018 version, some things that are updated, some tweaks and clarifications. We've added some guidance on modelling high flow bypasses and overflows, wetlands with multiple inlets, and some permeable paving. We've reviewed those rainfall templates and updated them. We've had some updates and clarifications on source nodes, on modelling settlement ponds, on our outflow and storage properties, hydrolytic routing and standalone sed ponds, and then a clarification or on our stormwater treatment devices. So over to you, Dale.
Great. Thanks so much, Liv, for the introduction, and welcome everyone to the webinar. I see we've still got people coming in, but hopefully we've got most of you here now. That's really good to see so many people coming. It's fair to say these guidelines have been a long time coming, and it's really good to see that we're at this point where we can release them to the industry. As you'd know, when you start out setting up a stormwater model, probably the first thing you have to do, get your head around and deal with, is the rainfall. So that was the first area we directed our attention to. And since the last guideline came out, there's been, I guess, a bit of a step change in our thinking and in the way we go about doing rainfall. And the main things that have changed there is that we're now paying a lot more attention to the quality of the rainfall that we're using. And we're also looking a lot more closely at the statistics of that rainfall. So what we did is we went back and we looked at all of the regions across Melbourne, and we have new tools now, and then they're not new anymore, they're probably 5 years old, but we have tools that we've developed since the last guidelines that allow us to infill the rainfall, looking at other stations in proximity that are closely statistically correlated with those stations. And what that means is that we now have better quality data sets we can work with. They're not purely data from that station because we've infilled data from other stations, but it's at least still temporally correct. There's different ways of doing that. We are then able to make choices about what period of rainfall do we use, which we've got a broader selection to choose from because we've got some better quality data. But it has also allowed us to have a close look at the regions we've got and the rainfall templates we're using and think about whether they're good enough and they're still fit for purpose, or whether we need to make some improvements. Next slide, thanks, Liv. So there were two particular ones that came to our attention. So to be honest, what we found is we did all our infilling and we did all this fancy stuff, and the reality is it actually didn't change things very much. Yes, we had slightly better rainfall data sets. We had to make a decision at that point. We could have brought out new template for every one of the templates, or we could just focus on the ones that were critical and where it was actually making a difference. And we chose that latter approach with the view that we don't want to make change just for the sake of making change, just for a marginal improvement that's not actually tangibly changing outcomes. So we're focused on these two regions where we know we've got some problems and we've improved those, but we did also consider the other ones, and it is possible to update the others, but we don't see a need at the moment. Melbourne Airport, we're aware, it's brought to our attention that there's actually a 4-month gap in the rainfall. Now, in terms of that's actual impact on treatment performance, it's not all that much because things kind of average and come out in the wash. But obviously, if you're doing stormwater harvesting and you're looking at reliability, or if you're trying to do an inundation frequency pattern on a wetland, or if you're trying to look at spells analysis for a bioretention system, gaps like that start to become a bit problematic. And so we've filled in that data and we've brought in data from some of the nearby stations. And the outcome of that is it doesn't actually have a whole lot of impact on wetland treatment system areas. They will change a little. Says there the performance will slightly improve. It does depend on your circumstances. Not everything, some will go up, some will go down. So it will shift just slightly. You should see some differences in your Melbourne Airport models as a result of that. But rest assured that we now have a better template, and it will be giving you better results. And it means that when you're doing those inundation frequency patterns, you won't have those weird little bits where everything's flat and the system dries out completely for a couple of months and you're wondering what's going on there. Clearwater was another one, and this one's a bit of an odd one. What we find is that as rainfall increases across the range, generally, broadly speaking, from west to east across Melbourne, what we see is that rainfall increases and the size of treatment assets, wetlands, bioretention, generally increases the rainfall increases. And we see that consistently across all of the templates, except for Clearwater. And Clearwater is something of an outlier. And what we see is that the performance in Clearwater is actually higher than it is in the Melbourne Regional template, and it's actually higher than the Melbourne Airport one as well. So it's something of an outlier, and it's looked a bit odd. And for that reason, we've spent some time and attention on it. Clearwater is right on the boundary of our area. And it probably wasn't the best choice of rainfall station. Back then we had to use what we had available. What we've done now is we've used Dandenong, which is still near the coast, but at least it's a bit more central and a bit further into the region. And what we find is that we're getting some more consistent results coming out of that to what we would expect looking at the other stations. So we think that's a better representation of what's likely to occur broadly across the region, acknowledging that we do have large regions and that there will be some variations within those, but it's a good quality data set and representative of what's happening across the eastern region. The second thing that comes to our attention with that is that we have some really big regions that right around Melbourne, and what's happening in the northwest is not necessarily the same as what's happening in the southeast. So we ended up actually splitting this region and introducing a second rainfall station to cover those areas in the northwest. It's called Bullingurk East, but it's basically, think Macedon, Gisborne, some of those townships up around the Macedon ranges that it's covering. And that gives us a better estimate of what is likely to happen in those areas, which have similar mean annual rainfalls to Dandenong or Clearwater, but the rainfall patterns in the mountains up there are actually quite different. And what we see is that we actually end up with an increase in treatment systems areas. We have to work a bit harder to get the treatment with those different rainfall patterns. So that's honestly probably now just reflecting reality a little better than it was before. Next slide, thanks, Liz. Liv. So another thing we wanted to do was to really look closely at the wetlands and how we're modelling wetlands. These are pretty important for Melbourne Water because we've got a lot of wetland assets and they're quite large and significant cost investments. One of the things that we noted was that there's some uncertainty and a lack of clarity about when do you model your sediment pond as an inlet pond in your wetland that's essentially represented as a single node with a sediment pond and a wetland integrated together, and when do you model it as a sediment pond that's separate to the wetland upstream and then it's draining down into the wetland. Now, in music, when we model two nodes like this and we model them as two separate nodes, essentially what we're saying to music is these two treatment systems are independent. They do not influence each other, and the water from the sediment pond is able to freely drain from the sediment pond out into the outlet, and then from there it will flow into the next treatment device. And there's no backwater, there's no influence of the wetland. Now, in practice, what happens is that sediment ponds are often located just upstream of a wetland, and there's often backwater from the wetland extending into the sediment pond, and the outlet from this wetland will actually influence the hydrologic behaviour of the sediment pond. Now, that's what the integrated inlet pond and sediment and wetland within music is intended to do in the wetland node. It's actually got the sediment pond and the wetland combined together into the one node. So what we decided is that we need to provide a clear rationale for when to use each of these. So what we've said is that if you can show that your sediment pond is mostly hydraulically independent of the wetland, then you can model it as separate. We could have said entirely hydraulically independent. We felt that was perhaps potentially too onerous and unreasonable. So we've said if it's mostly independent, model it as separate. But if they're mostly interlinked and the flows from the sediment pond are going to the wetland and then it's backwatering and they're interacting, then let's model it as a single system. So the guidance that we've put is that if the difference in the extended detention depths is more than half of the extended detention depth of the wetland, then you can model them as independent. Otherwise, do the reverse essentially. And I've got you can see there the guidance. Now, that will probably have some impacts. no doubt some people will find that when they go from using a separated system to using a combined system, what happens in music is that you get more bypassing of that sediment pond. You get a drop in treatment performance because essentially the wetland is inhibiting its ability to function effectively. And so you may find that you end up needing larger treatment sets. On the flip side, that's an opportunity for you to start thinking about your design and say, well, if we don't want it to be hydraulically dependent, how can we design it to not be? And that might mean you move that sediment pond further upstream. It might mean that you split it and model 2 separate sediment ponds at different locations. It might mean that you tweak the levels that you're using so that you can make them independent. Or it might mean that you accept in some cases that, well, actually they were never hydraulically independent and we really should actually simply be modeling these as a sediment pond and a wetland in one node anyway. And that's fine. Next slide, thanks, Liv. Similar vein to that, we're seeing music has the secondary link functionality is now well established and embedded, but we're seeing sometimes people have some difficulties in terms of how to interpret the overflows and bypasses. So it's worth saying in music, you have high flow bypass, low flow bypass, weir overflows, and then you have your outflow from your system. The high flow bypasses and low flow are routed entirely around that node. And then the weir overflow is actually routed through the node, through that particular treatment system, and then is allowed to spill over the weir relatively quickly at the downstream end of it. In a wetland, that functions a little bit differently because those weir overflows are actually coming from the sed pond at the front end of it and spilling out from there, and they're not passing through the rest of the wetland to get that additional treatment. Now, after the node, all of those are combined back together. So you have low flow bypass, outflow, weir overflow, and high flow bypass are all combined together into the outflows that are reported from music from that node. Now, that is obvious, but it's also not obvious. And what that means is sometimes people have 2 treatment systems in series. They've got a sediment pond that's separate and then a wetland. They've got a high flow bypass channel that's routing flow all the way around those 2 assets. To represent that in music, we actually have to explicitly spell that out for music and put a secondary link in and say this high flow bypass is not only going around this node, but we're going to use a secondary link and route it around the downstream wetland and then send it into a node somewhere further downstream. And then in that secondary link, we'll check the high flow bypass option to make sure that it's sending those flows around it. So that's just providing some clarity for people on what music's doing and what music's thinking. So there's some guidance on that, and there's a few different diagrams just to explain how to go about setting those up and the thinking for how to model what's actually happening in practice as closely and accurately as you can. Next slide, thanks. So hopefully that guidance will help people to have a clearer picture and a clearer understanding of what music is doing and what is going on under the hood, as it were. On the one hand, the purpose of these guidelines is just to set out Melbourne Water's expectations, Melbourne Water standards, and what you need to do to submit what you need to put into a model that you're submitting to Melbourne Water. On the other hand, we also want it to be providing some guidance and some learning materials so that new people coming into our industry can get a better understanding of what's actually happening, what the models are doing, and to be thinking when they're doing modelling of how do I make this mathematical model and representation of a real system most closely represent the reality that's occurring, accepting that it's a mathematical model, it's imperfect and we're not going to have everything, but how do we make it represented as closely as we can? So we've also got some basic guidance on routing, and it's probably fair to say that universally in our industry, hardly anyone is using any routing at all. And that's probably not the end of the world, because if you use routing, what you'll find is that usually your results get better. So not using it is in the majority of cases conservative. However, sometimes that can break down or not quite be entirely correct. If you do want to use some routing, the first thing I'd say is that you need to apply it consistently. You can't just routing on one link and not on the other links. You need to do it consistently throughout your model wherever it makes sense to put it in. Anything that's a constructed asset, be it a pipe or a concrete channel, you can get away with just using what's called translation. And that's essentially saying this link has a physical travel time and it takes 20 minutes for water to get from one end of this channel to the other. So we're going to put that into music and we're going to say that's the travel time through this link. The other thing that you can specify in music is the time of concentration for the catchment. Music is not calculating that, and it's not explicitly representing that. So if you have catchments that are different sizes, and significantly different sizes, you may want to represent that, you know, the travel time in one catchment might be 10 minutes or 6 minutes, because that's the time step music is using. And then in this other catchment, you might say that it's 18 minutes or 24 minutes. And what that means is that will start to split the coincidence of peaks. So instead of music saying all of the water instantaneously moved through the model and went from these catchments to this treatment, and everything was instantaneous except for what was happening inside the treatments, what it will now start doing is actually lagging some of those flows so that they arrive at different times. And that will mean that the peaks experienced by the treatments will be a little less extreme, and that generally you'll see some better treatment coming through. But it does become important if, for example, you've got a stormwater harvesting scheme where you've got a pipe diversion with a fixed flow rate, or you've got a pump with a fixed flow rate pumping from a storage, pumping out to another treatment system, or pumping directly to reuse. That will then influence the performance that you see on those, and it will influence how much water is going to which of those two pathways. So that's routing. So if you don't like it, if it's too complex, feel free to not use it. But in the interest of starting to make our models more closely represent reality, it is something that should be on our radar and we should be considering, particularly for larger catchments and particularly for stormwater harvesting schemes with flow rate sensitive diversions. Just note on the secondary links that you can redirect flows where you need to, and we do this a lot for stormwater harvesting schemes where we've got pumps, but you can also redirect flows for catchments. So you can send the surface and base flows to different locations. We rarely think about it, but the reality is that at the lot scale, base flows probably are never coming into our treatment systems. They're probably just going underneath through the ground and coming out in the drainage system somewhere downstream. But we routinely just model them with all the flows going into them, and we don't really give that a second thought. But if you want to do your modelling accurately, you could start thinking about that. Similarly, infiltration, reuse, evapotranspiration, we can control those if we have a need to. Next slide, thank you. So another area where we find people have lots of trouble and lots of difficulties, and look, there's a few foibles in music itself that could probably be set up, and I'm talking music version 6.3 here. There's probably a few things in the model that could be a bit easier to use. One of the things that we see trips, you set the extended detention depth, and then you go into your custom stage storage discharge. And what that means is that the custom stage storage discharge overrides all your user input. So you don't need to think about your outlet pipe, you don't need to think about your weir, because all that's overridden by what you're feeding in. But the extended detention depth that was specified in that form before you went into the custom stage storage discharge is actually still important. And music is expecting that you will provide it with data for that custom stage storage discharge curve for everything up to 2 meters plus that depth. So say it's 0.35 meters, such as the example here, then you need to give it values all the way up to 2.35 meters in height. Now, that's not stated anywhere, it's not obvious. So it's in the guidelines now. So if you're having trouble and your music models are giving errors after you put your custom stage storage discharge in, have a look through that guidance, and hopefully that will help to clarify it. Just to step back and say, well, why are we even doing these? The reason we do custom stage storage discharge relationships is that in music, if we just put in the basic input parameters, it's essentially assuming that the wetland or pond that we're modelling has vertical sides on it, and that there's a constant relationship between that depth and that volume. Now, we know that that's nowhere near accurate for the vast majority of our assets, and that if we then try and look at a wetland inundation frequency pattern, or if we then try and look at what is the residence time of that wetland, we're not going to get very accurate results just using those very simplified assumptions. So it's really important for those particularly bigger assets and the wetlands and the like that we're actually modelling an accurate stage storage discharge relationship. Now, I appreciate if you're doing concept level, you might not have that yet, so you're simplifying, but at functional and detailed design, we should have that bathymetry. We should be able to put those details into the model so we're actually representing what's happening in real life. Next slide, thanks, Liv. So We've had a fair bit of focus on the wetlands, and we've really spent a bit of time trying to just provide clarifications, tightening things up a little, sort of maybe possibly closing some loopholes, but also providing clearer guidance and clarity so that people are able to model more consistently and with greater confidence. It was mentioned before that we're heading towards Release B, and Release B will introduce flow objectives and how to model those, and it will introduce a number of additional treatment types and classes that we're not currently providing guidance for, but we know are out there in the industry and being used. We did manage to slip one in to this set of guidelines, so we have permeable paving. So we've provided some recommendations for how to model a permeable paving asset or system using the media filtration node. Now, that's not the only way of doing that, but it's possibly the most common, or hopefully the most common. We are making an assumption here that you have a permeable paving asset that is, maybe being used for car parking or similar purposes, that you have an asset that has under drainage in it, and that the water will flow through that system. Ideally, it will infiltrate to the subsoil if your subsoil supports it, but then you may also have an under drain sitting in the base of the system, or preferably not in the base, but a little bit higher, so that water will preferentially infiltrate, but if necessary, water will also be carried away by that under drainage, so that we're not saturating the pavement, we're not saturating roads adjacent, and we're not saturating trees that are growing there, so you'll have that under drainage. Next slide, thanks, Liv. So permeable pavement, there's different types. There's various guidelines and so forth out there, but it could be porous concrete, could be porous asphalt, could be the interlocking pavers. And then there's a few other weird and wonderfuls. There's grass and there's gravel pave and all sorts of things. So this will provide you some guidance on modelling these various different types of permeable pavement, and it's probably fair to say there hasn't been a lot of uptake of this in Australia compared to overseas, and hopefully providing this guidance will help to facilitate and enable some of that. At the same time, we appreciate that it's a lot easier to do a small rain garden than trying to do a very large expanse of permeable paving. There's maintenance implications and all that, but it is a good solution and application for certain circumstances. Now, music does have a few limitations. We're using the media filtration node, which is originally set up based on a set of data that was focused mostly on sand filters and proprietary filters. And that work was done by Hugh Duncan maybe about 20 years ago. Now, that data set did include a number of gravel filters that more closely represent what's going on in a permeable pavement in terms of the gravel aggregate that's sitting underneath it and the likely performance. So it's an adequate and good enough representation for now of the stormwater quality treatment performance, but it is dated and it's by no means perfect, and that's an area that we have on our radar for future improvements. Music doesn't represent evapotranspiration in the media filtration node, and we know that some of these pavements will be doing a bit of evapotranspiration. It's probably conservative to leave it out. And we're not representing clogging, and we know that these assets will clog up over time. We've done a bit of work on those, and what we are saying is that you need to use a conservative saturated hydraulic conductivity. The manufacturer will say we can infiltrate water through the system, and it's got an infiltration rate of 4,000 millimetres an hour, and it will for the first week that it's in place. But that will decline, and the evidence we have from the work we've done to date suggests that it will decline exponentially. It will drop off quite rapidly as sediment starts to accumulate and build up in that pavement. That said, it will retain a reasonable hydraulic conductivity for quite a long period of time, and we've tested systems that are 5-6 years old that are actually still working quite perfectly well. They're not hitting 4,000 millimetres an hour, but they don't need to. If they're doing 50 mil an hour, that's enough for any rainfall that we're interested in for water quality and for stormwater treatment, and it'll even do a pretty decent job of managing, even a 1 in 10 year flood event. So it's still pretty good. The guidance we're giving is conductivities. Please set it to somewhere in the range of 100 to 200 mil an hour, recognising that that's a lot less than what's theoretically possible, but also balancing that clogging risk. We would note we did consider using the infiltration node, and for systems with no under drainage would potentially still revert to using that. One of the limitations is it has nothing in it to do with the media related treatment performance, so it's really just representing that void as a pond, essentially, as a storage with a porosity that's limiting it. Now, music isn't the only thing that's out there in terms of tools for modelling stormwater, and it isn't the only one that you should necessarily be thinking of. So I would just draw to your attention, if you're modelling permeable pavement, that there are other tools and that they can provide some guidance on the structural inputs. I'd probably use music for water quality, but for structural, be aware that there's some other considerations. So I would say have a look at Design Pave, but not only do that, but talk to your proprietary manufacturers, because they have a really good knowledge of what's going on, and talk to your client about what are their common design practices, because you might find that what you're getting out of music or what you're getting out of Design Pave doesn't always align with what's actually happening in practice, and you might need to make some adjustments or tweaks to either your modelling or your design to get a good solution. Sorry, we're departing a bit from pure music guidelines here. Next slide, thanks, Liv. Okay. Now, there's a couple of other things that we've got in the guidelines, and this is really intended as a bit of a clarification. But there's been some concerns raised that standalone sediment ponds are getting used occasionally, and usually the use cases for these will be where you've got a development, you've got 80 or 90% of it's going to your main treatment train, that's going to your sediment pond and your wetland as per usual, but you've got a little bit over on the side that is draining off to its own little area, and you can't get it back into the main drainage pathway, or going to a different catchment going the opposite direction entirely, and maybe you don't have the space to actually get a full treatment train in place because, you know, maybe there wasn't consideration in the early stages of planning and design of that land to say, well, where are we putting our water sensitive urban design assets, and we need to be setting aside these spaces. There might not have been that thinking, and physically and practically sometimes the landform simply doesn't allow for it. So what we see is sometimes we're getting these standalone sediment ponds where you've just got a sediment pond where we say, look, can't do everything, but at the minimum, let's get sediment treatment in, because you're chasing a high target for sediment. It's 80%. If you miss 10% of your catchment, that means the rest of your catchment, you've got to do 90%. And then diminishing returns kicks in, and getting that extra 10%, you know, you end up with a huge increase in what you have to do to get that sediment out, because you've got that other catchment you're missing. So it's better often in those cases to put that sediment pond on that additional catchment. That said, what we're seeing is that some people are taking advantage of that opportunity and maybe sizing those sediment ponds a little larger than is really necessary for coarse sediment removal, and really necessary to meet, you know, the Fair Gaia type guidance, which is providing guidance on appropriate sizing for sediment basins to remove that coarse sediment. There's been some more work done and research done on nutrient removal in ponds, sediment ponds and wetlands, and that's really firming up the long-held views that vegetation is really important for nutrient removal. That yes, the ponds are great for providing sediment settling. There will be a certain amount of settling of particulates in these systems, but we really need vegetation to be actively taking up those nutrients, doing something with them, removing, binding them up, taking them out, you know, allowing it to return to the atmosphere, binding it into the soil. We need plants in these systems for that to happen, and we're seeing a really significant difference in the performance for nitrogen of systems with vegetation versus those with no vegetation or not very much. So what we're saying is, for these systems, we really shouldn't be assuming that there's nitrogen removal. And look, by extension, we could be suggesting that we should be assuming relatively little nitrogen removal in any of the sediment ponds. As a compromise, what we're saying is that if you've got sediment ponds upstream of wetlands, you can still assume that they're effective for nitrogen, because that will just offset what the wetland's doing. But where we've got these standalone systems, what we're saying is, now please set the K value to 0, which is essentially saying let's assume no nitrogen treatment in these systems. You know, what's the right answer? It's probably 5 or 10 or something. It's not 300, but it'll be somewhere in between. To be conservative at the moment, we're saying set that to 0. We understand and appreciate that is going to have some impacts in terms of how these systems are designed and what may get rolled out in the field. So we will have some further discussions around that, just to understand how that's playing out in industry, and whether we need to make any tweaks to that in future. Next slide. I think that's me, so I'll hand back to you to continue on. Thank you.
Sorry, just struggling to come off mute there. So the proprietary products, and so this was in response to some industry requests, just clearer guidance on our approach to the proprietary treatment products. We do acknowledge that they play an important role in a lot of places as part of the solution for stormwater management, but they may not be a replacement of nature-based solutions in our development services scheme. And where we're not the decision maker, that's up to the other decision makers. We do support a national approach for proprietary stormwater treatment validation. I think that covers it. So wrap up in summary. So the cutoff for submitting new models following the old guidelines is going to be the end of this financial year, so June 30th, 2024. Those new rainfall templates will apply. Dale's been through the sediment ponds and wetlands and the nitrogen removal and those proprietary products, manufactured devices ones. What's coming next? So we're going to continue the transition to these updated guidelines and retire that old one at the end of June. And after that, we'll have an update to the practitioner's note to make sure that the numbers for those rainfall templates are in line, because that refers to the rainfall templates. The music auditor is getting updated as well to match those new templates. Those old documents are still up on the website for reference, and they will get removed eventually. So if you want to archive them, please do. We are also working on the emerging assets documents, and many of you will remember from previous Stormwater Vic sessions. So that's bringing together information for assets that are focused on stormwater harvesting and infiltration. And when we release that, we'll have another update to the music modelling guideline, which will integrate those sets. And that's time for questions. So yeah, I do want to preface this. As I said earlier, there might be some things that come up that we can't answer today. And also maybe you'll think of other questions outside of the session as you're getting used to following the new guidelines. So for any of those, we'll follow up if you send them through to the inquiries at Melbourne Water email address. And I think it's back to Julia.
Hello, everyone. There's a lot of great questions coming through. Bear with me. Any ones that we miss in this live session, I will send through to the team at Melbourne Water to answer offline. We've had some good answers also in the chat. So if you've asked a question, feel free to flick through. There's been some really good peer answers. Really quickly, just start with some questions just generally about the guidelines. And asks, is it still correct to refer to the Urban Stormwater Best Practice Environmental Management Guidelines, Victoria Stormwater Committee 1999?
So if no one else wants to take that, I think the answer to that one is yes. We are still using BEPM. Obviously, the EPA guidance has changed, and so the references to all the EPA acts have changed, but they are still pointing back to the CSIRO guidelines and BEPM at present. We'd love to see that updated at some point, but that's an even bigger task than doing these guidelines. So, yeah.
That's good. I'm going to switch over to some questions about rainfall, generally speaking. Jessica asks, how was the data infilled from the nearby stations from Melbourne Airport? Was it just a direct infill for the missing dates, or was it a bigger job?
Yeah, so with the infilling, we are doing what you've said, is that we're looking at the other stations in proximity and we're infilling. So we are only infilling where there's actually missing data. If BOM says it's zero rainfall, we take their word for it that it's zero rainfall on that day. So we're only taking the dates where BOM has tagged it as being missing or accumulated data and says we don't actually have good data for these periods. And what we're then doing is we're looking at the stations in the vicinity of that station. We're identifying which one has the highest statistical correlation. So it's the closest in terms of those two stations having similar data, which isn't necessarily the closest station, because if you're in the hills, what you can see is that the rainfall can change very quickly in a short space. Sometimes the best station to use is not the closest. but we're generally adopting the the best, most representative station. We're taking data from that. It then goes to, if there's no data there, it then goes to the next station and then the next station, and we allow it to do a range of different stations and bring in that data. So the idea is that we're using the best available data for that particular point in time to infill. Now, because of that particular process, it means that there are still gaps in the data because sometimes there is no data available and we haven't infilled everything, but they're much, much, much less than they were. And we're then reviewing the quality to make sure that we've actually got good quality data sets afterwards. But it also means that we're confident that that data is somewhat grounded in reality. We're not just stochastically making it up, which is not to say that isn't a valid and alternate approach. Realistically, I think in the next set of guidelines we bring out, there's probably going to be a step change in rainfall, and we'll probably be using longer templates. We'll probably be using multiple templates, not just one, and you'll probably have both current templates and future climate change projections. But that is going to take a bit of work, so it's probably going to be not the next set of guidelines, it'll be the one after in 3 years' time or something like that.
Got to follow up a couple more great rainfall questions coming from Neil.
Yep.
And probably, Dale, you've touched on it, but Niels asks, has Melbourne Water, and I suspect you too, investigated the viability of using synthetic 6-minute data to remove any errors related to physical rain gauges in real life?
Yep, we have, and we've tried generating some synthetic data. There's a couple of different approaches out there for doing that. We've looked at using the GCMs or the global climate models, and to be fair, I should say we haven't looked at it. Actually, other people have done that work. There's been a review of that data, and we're very hopeful that that would so we could make use of that. It said it was fairly confident in the daily data that was coming out, but it raised some questions about the sub-daily and particularly the hourly and 6-minute data. There's some limitations there. There's some really good data sets, but they're only available at 30-minute, not 6-minute. The 6-minute data that's available, there are some limitations in terms of trying to predict and generate that data, and you really need to go back and really closely look at whether you're representing the statistics, the patterns of the actual historical rainfall, whether you're capturing the peaks, and whether you're getting that balance of all those things. And we may find that we actually have to use different data sets, some that are suitable for stormwater quality but maybe aren't quite getting the peaks, and then other ones that are suitable for, say, flood modelling, where those peaks are really critical, but maybe the intervening dry periods aren't quite as good and that sort of thing. To be honest, I expect, as I foreshadowed, that in the next round we quite possibly will be moving to using stochastic data or using a blend of historical and stochastic data.
Brilliant. As a follow-up, I've got a couple of questions related to how the rainfall templates do or do not include the impacts of climate change and how practitioners might be able to adjust them to allow for climate change. Do you have any thoughts on that, Dale?
Yeah, firstly, they do not. They are based on what is the long-term statistical historical average, using as much data as we have available for as many stations as we have available to quantify each region, so that we're making full use of the data. What we will probably be doing in the next round is that we will be saying we are only going to use the last 40 or 50 years of data, accepting that there has already been significant climate change that has occurred, and we are already seeing trends and shifts in the rainfall, and that will better reflect what's happening now, but also balance making sure we've got a decent amount of data. We've just had 15 years of millennium drought, and then we've had 10 years of above average rainfall. If we use anything in the last 25 years, it's not going to represent any reality of what's likely to happen in the future. So we need to be careful in what we're picking up and what we're using. We need to make sure that we've got a long enough period that we're representing that. Future climate change projections, wonderful. We've built some templates for that. We've got templates for a future dry case, we've got templates for a future wet case, we've got templates for something in between. What we find is that the most conservative templates for stormwater quality are either the current ones or the ones that predict a wet, low increase in temperature future where there's not too much change. That's not surprising because that's saying that the rainfall's not dropping off too much. The hot dry futures will have a big impact on stormwater harvesting, and we'll see that drop off. That said, worst case we've seen is about a 10% decrease in yield. But what we see with those templates is that you get better performance out of your assets, and they're actually non-conservative. If we think about it, that we should be considering both or multiple cases, then the one that will actually be driving our sizing will either be the current one or the wet, not so hot future, which is still a possible and valid possible future. That will be driving our sizing if we start doing that. So we've come back to, we may as well just continue using what we've got now. Thank you.
No, thanks so much, Dale, for the detailed answer. We have many, many really technical questions on modeling assets in music. And I'm going to hopefully get through a couple of these, but it's going to be an in-depth answer. And I'm going to ask you all to please come back to us and to look for a better answer via written response, because we're not going to get through all of them in 15 minutes. So Dale, I'm just going to start with some questions around sediment ponds, because that was a big part of your presentation. Diane asks, can you please clarify how to model wetlands with multiple sediment pond inflows, particularly if they're not hydraulically independent, like your handy figure in the presentation?
Yeah, okay. Yes, we have provided some guidance around these multiple sediment pond inflows. Where they are hydraulically independent, it's a little more straightforward because you can model that as a separate system, and then you can split that system to represent the different inflows coming in. So you can proportionally say 40% of the inflows coming off this flow path, and we'll size the sediment pond accordingly. This one, 60%, we'll size it accordingly. Where it's hydraulically interconnected, then we really do need to have it coming into just that single node and representing that as a single system. In those cases, then there are some limitations of what we can do. So we are modeling it as all coming into one. We have given some fairly detailed guidance on that in the guidelines. I didn't cover it today just in the interest of not being able to get through everything we've got. That said, please have a look through those, see if it makes sense to you. If you've got any questions or you're still not clear, come back and let's talk. We need to make sure this is clear for everyone and we've all got good pathways forward. Also, I have some good ideas and I have some experience modelling, but I'm not the be all and end all. There's lots of smart people out in industry. So if together we come up with a better way of presenting this or even a better way of doing this, then let's work through that and work out what that looks like. And then we can look at bringing that in when we do release B, which hopefully is not too far away. We can look at making some tweaks to these guidelines. So we're probably in a unique position that the next update of the guidelines is years away.
Excellent. Just being wary of the time, I've got a question from Hamid, and he asks, for the single wetland node, how do you model the stage storage discharge relationship for the sediment pond proportion? Just because it does get a bit tricky in that design stage. Do you have any great advice on that, Dale?
Yeah, I understand. Look, you've really got to look at how the system's working and how it's connected. What I would probably come back to is that if it really is not hydraulically independent, then the wetland outlet and the control structures on the wetland are going to be driving a lot of what's happening in the said pond. So what you would probably come back to is representing that as one system and modeling all of your storage as one connected cohesive system, regardless of whether that storage is sitting in your wetland or your said pond. You'd model that all as one system in terms of setting up your stage storage discharge curve for your wetland. So you just be putting in one setup. Now, that does mean that you lose the intricacies and the detail of exactly what's going on in terms of those connections between the said pond and the wetland. If you've got pipes that are restricting flows and limiting things, you're then not fully representing all the detail of exactly what's going on there. That's a trade-off we have to make. Look, the other way of doing it is to look at whether you can get enough separation between the two. You might tweak your extended detention levels. You might tweak exactly where your said pond's sitting or the level so that you can get it independent, and then you can more accurately represent what's happening with those structures, pipes and weirs and whatever connecting the two systems. Look, we're working within the limitations of an existing model. In the future, maybe we can improve what's actually going on so we can represent that more accurately.
Thanks so much, Dale. One more technical modeling question, just while we've got you on the line. Neil asked, on stage storage discharge curves, is it fair to say we should only really use the generic orifice diameter, or parameters early on in the design process to guide what's necessary to achieve that 72-hour detention time, and then move to a custom stage storage approach as soon as you have any real design information.
Niels, yeah, in an ideal world, yes, we should be doing that as much as we can. In practical terms, it's a lot more effort to set that up than it is to just use the conceptual modelling. So there is a time and place to do that high-level modelling where you're doing a lot of change to the design and the systems, and there's a lot of flux. Or, you know, if you're just doing high-level prioritisation of assets and you're trying to model 20 different wetlands, probably not going to have that data, and it's going to be too much work to keep changing that. But certainly once you're getting to a functional or a detailed design and you've got that data, absolutely we need to be putting it into our systems. But it is that balance of effort versus accuracy. We do need to have that in mind. We can't just make everyone do it all the time. So, thank you.
I've got a couple of questions. We're just kind of heading towards the wrap-up stage. I've got a couple of questions, one from Neil and one from Patty, around how the performance of an asset changes over time. Patty asks, how does the music model, how does it assess the asset lifecycle performance? And Niels asks a very similar question of how do you take into consideration the degradation of those assets over time?
Yeah, great question. I was talking to someone in asset management yesterday, actually, and we were talking about with WUSIT assets, they're a little bit unique. They're not like roads or other asset which degrade with a fairly, not linear, but a fairly predictable profile over time. A sediment pond accumulates sediment and its effectiveness can degrade over time as it fills up with sediment, and maybe it isn't able to trap as much and capture it as effectively. The same can happen with wetlands and even bioretention and permeable pavement. That's why we have those requirements about being conservative about the hydraulic conductivities, and that's trying to get an approximation of what is its behaviour over a period of time, with maybe a good starting point and then a lower ending point. That said, what we're also seeing is that wetlands mature over time and the plants establish and they grow and they get bigger. Trees grow and they get much larger if we're doing passively irrigated street trees. Rain garden media gets more established, and what we're seeing is some of the evidence is actually suggesting that our WUSIT assets can get better with time. And as those assets mature, they can actually become more effective at doing their job because they've got better vegetation, they've got more root systems established, more canopy cover. And so the value and the benefits of these assets can decrease due to some factors, but it can also increase due to other factors. Music is assuming everything is static and it's a single point in time, and we're really trying to do an average approximation across that 20 or 30-year life cycle. Asset management people are starting to talk about how can we start capturing those both declines and increases in condition and capture that. We're not yet there with music in terms of capturing it. That said, there are clogging models out there. I did it for my PhD, and Nilmini Siriwardena did her entire PhD on modelling clogging of infiltration systems and permeable pavements are the same. There is science out there that could be built into the models. It just hasn't happened yet.
Excellent. I've got a couple of questions. This is probably for the Melbourne Water team. Inoka asks, was there any consideration to the Melbourne Water healthy waterway strategy requirements in updating these music guidelines?
I'll jump in for that one. So the flow targets and stuff is going to come through in release B. So not in this one so much, but stay tuned.
Thanks, Liz. I've got another one probably for you. And this one comes from Tess, and she asks, would you like us to put our feedback somewhere publicly for release A? Are you interested in industry feedback on release A? And if so, where's the right place to put it?
We have got anything set up at the moment, but I will look at what we can do. And there's a few questions in there as well with a lot of technical ones that we haven't been able to get into. So we will keep in touch with the industry and make sure that we can support the transition.
But support of the transition is probably where I wanted to end things and wrap it up. There was a great question from Val in the chat saying that a lot of this modeling is fairly technical music modeling, and will there be some training courses and will there be some support in the industry, because this is leveling up what we usually do.
Hello, Val. It's Aaron Sonata, Manager of Stormwater Policy and Flood Strategy. Yeah, we'll take that question on notice, Val. Really good point, and we'll have a look and see what we can do and get back to the group. Definitely want to see if we can help in any way. They're not sure what that'll look like, so I'll take that one on notice.
Brilliant. Thank you all so much for coming. There are way more questions than we can get through with Dale and Liv and the team from Melbourne Water today. Liv, if you could pop that last slide up, I'm gonna wrap things up and we're gonna call it a day. Thanks so much. Thank you so much for coming to this technical webinar. Please give Stormwater Victoria 2 minutes of your time and complete the exit survey just to let us help bring you better technical content in the future. If you enjoyed this presentation, please consider becoming a member of Stormwater Victoria. We do great events like this all the time. And if you got really excited to learn new things and chat to experts, consider attending the Stormwater Victoria conference. It's in San Remo at the beginning of June, and information about registration is available on the web. Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you for your fabulous questions. Thank you for your patience with our technical difficulties. Have a wonderful day.